From Washington, D.C., John McLaughlin's One-on-One, an unrehearsed probing inside exchange with the people making the news.
This program is set in motion by a grant from the MetLife family of companies with over $110 billion in assets under management.
And by PepsiCo.
Can I help you? Can I help you? Ah!
The first thing every PepsiCo employee learns is,
can I help you?
Now, with a profile of the guest, John McLaughlin.
In the GOP primary in Iowa this week, Bob Dole and Pat Robertson swamped George Bush. Among Democrats, Dick Gephardt rolled Paul Simon and Michael Dukakis. Can the Iowa winners, Dole and Gephardt, repeat their victories in New Hampshire? We'll ask two prescient political analysts. Born San Francisco, 46 years of age, wife Florence, 15 years, 2 children. Colby College, Maine, B.A. Lewis Harrison Associates, polling firm, political analyst, 7 years. Peter Hart and Associates, polling firm, CEO, 17 years and currently. Peter David Hart. Born Cleveland, 54 years of age, wife Patricia, 26 years, 2 children. Colgate University, B.A. Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy, Ph.D. Bailey Deardorff, a GOP political consulting firm, president, 25 years and currently. Campaign Presidential Hotline, a daily political newsletter. Executive publisher, 6 months and currently. Douglas Bailey. Peter, you're one. Doug, you're one. It's one-on-one. Question. Let's imagine that this is Wednesday morning, February 17th, the day after the New Hampshire primary, the first primary of the 1988 presidential race. What are the headlines going to say? Peter.
Bush in trouble. Dukakis starts his move south.
You mean Bush is going to lose?
I don't know if Bush is going to lose. I'm not ready to say that, but I am going to say that whatever the result is coming out of New Hampshire, Bush is in trouble. It'll either be that close and he'll barely win, or he could lose it.
Doug, if Bush loses in New Hampshire, does that mean that his campaign is unraveling?
Well, it surely means the campaign is unraveling. I do not go so far as to say it's over. Quite the contrary. Dole has shown very little support in the South. The strength of Bush in the South has been very great. Now, that doesn't mean that he's not. He's got a lot of problems, but he's going to be in this fight until the convention, and anybody who thinks he's not is fooling them.
Is Bush on the right track now? He's forsaken his limousine, he's taken to driving 18-wheelers, and he's taken also to excoriating his opponent Bob Dole by saying that Bob Dole is responsible in a significant way for the chaos that obtains in the United States Congress. Is that the right track for Bush?
No. George Bush is not on the right track yet, and I'll tell you why not. Because I've gone through this. 4 years ago, I worked for Walter Mondale, and I knew the high coming out of Iowa, and I saw the low coming out of New Hampshire. The difference is that Walter Mondale reached inside himself and he said, this is what I'm about, and this is why I'm running, and this is what I'm fighting for. George Bush hasn't done that. He's tactically working this campaign. I don't see him yet sort of saying, this is what I'm about. Doug?
My sense is that you haven't seen George Bush be presidential in 3 weeks. He may have won a round against Dan Rather, but that wasn't presidential. He may have tactically made a mistake by attacking Bob Dole, but that wasn't presidential either. And it's not presidential to be driving the trucks. What is presidential would be to lay out an agenda as to where he wants to take the country. We haven't heard that, and frankly, I think that's the biggest reason why he's had some bad days.
If you were giving counsel to Bob Dole as to how he could maximize his win in Iowa, what would you tell him to do? What 3 things would you tell Dole to do?
For me, I think, one, he needs to go forward. I mean, what he's doing is he's really talking about, this is what I've done, and all the little insider things. It was fascinating when he talked about his win on Monday night. He talked about things tactically. He didn't talk about the fight. This is what I'm fighting for, and this is what it's about. I watched him in Nashua on Wednesday night. The same thing. The larger picture of Bob Dole has yet to come forward.
Yeah, he too has the opportunity to lay out his agenda for the next 4 years or for his presidency. And if he did that and kept on that road positively, I think he would have Bush in very deep trouble.
Would you tell him to be more conservative, particularly on the matter of Contra aid? Would you tell him to lay off Iran-Contra? Would you tell him to leave the Bush bashing up to his lieutenants and stay out of it himself?
I think he has to lay out his agenda, and I think he can be more conservative on Contra aid, and he ought to stay off the Bush bashing, but he has in New Hampshire.
What's the real reason why Dole won in Iowa? Peter?
Pure and simple. I think that he was stronger. I think he was better. He looked more presidential. And in part, he fits what a lot of voters are looking for in 1988. And part of that is the policy-making ability. That is, not understanding minutia or having a resume, but is the sense of putting together policy. That's what worked for Bob Dole.
I have a different view of that. I think that the Iowa caucus, and to some degree the New Hampshire primary, is a referendum on George Bush. He is the front runner. He is the perceived next president of the United States. Voters think of it that way. Do I want George Bush as president or not? It's a referendum on George Bush. George Bush lost that referendum. If you don't like George Bush, if you decide not to vote for him in the referendum, there's Bob Dole. He's a neighbor. He's available. He's an acceptable alternative. Now I think Dole becomes the front runner, and he gets a little bit of focus.
Isn't this really a simple question, though? Isn't it true that Dole ran that campaign like a Senate campaign in Kansas, i.e., I can deliver, I can bring home the bacon, I can take care of you, witness the fact that I got you a wheat deal back on the tracks with the Soviet Union, number one. That's why he won. Secondly, he won because he's a neighboring state senator. That's what it is.
They were comfortable with him, but I think the focus was on George Bush, and because they were comfortable with Bob Dole, when they looked for an alternative there to Bush, there was Dole.
And
that is a large margin.
I'm not here as a Bob Dole apologist or even a person who favors him, but I will make one point. In 1980, he came from the same state of Kansas, and he still ended up with almost no vote.
That's correct. But he had not delivered to the farmers the way he delivered with the wheat deal. Let me ask.
If you believe that, then you believe he's going to go nowhere except in his little geographic extremities, or close to him, and proximity. And the fact of the matter is, he's going to do just fine elsewhere.
How come Robertson won so big in Iowa?
Democratic crossovers. And an appeal to a group of voters that have not participated in the political process generally. They voted for Ronald Reagan, 1980, 1984, but they don't involve themselves in the party process.
Pro-lifers?
Lots of Republicans, pro-lifers, and lots of Democratic crossovers.
What about the fact that Ronald Reagan has given the social issue Republicans and conservatives very little, and as a result they turned to Pat Robertson to fill that void?
I think there's some truth in that.
You do?
Yep.
Do you think that Robertson's, is everyone overlooking the negatives that attach? You know, you're a pollster. You know that Robertson's negatives are massive. Does that not suggest to you that New Hampshire is going to be a far different state for him than was Iowa?
Without a doubt. I think he's got negatives, and it's all going to come into play. The smaller the field, the worse it's going to be for Pat Robertson.
I think that's right, but I don't think you'll see it at play for that reason in New Hampshire. I think New Hampshire is different because there will be no Democratic crossovers. That's not possible. And secondly, there still has not been a focus from the other candidates on Pat Robertson. What has been amazing to me about this race is there have been how many Republican debates? In not one of those debates has one Republican candidate stood up and said, no, I don't agree with you, Pat Robertson. There's been no, and in the end, you know, the problem that Robertson faces, I mean that the party faces, is Robertson holding on to 500, 600 delegates at the Republican convention. That's a problem.
Which Republican candidate will emerge first in Tuesday's primary in New Hampshire? Peter?
I would tell you Dukakis on the Democratic side. On the Republican side, I think Bush narrowly.
Bush narrowly. What do you say, Doug?
I think virtual dead heat. I would bet on Dole if I had to bet.
Which Republican candidate will come in second in New Hampshire?
Oh, I think that's easy. The other person, which would be Dole in this case.
Dole in this case, and you would say Bush in this case.
Right.
Who will come in third in New Hampshire, Robertson or Kemp?
Robertson.
You're saying Robertson?
Yes, sir.
What do you say,
I would
Peter?
agree. The updraft's with Robertson.
Doug, Al Haig withdrew from the presidential race and threw his support behind Bob Dole. any impact from that that's significant?
Yeah, a lot of impact. It's not that there were a great many Haig supporters that Dole could pick up, but Haig's statement was very pro-Dole and very anti-Bush and dominated the nightly news on Friday night.
So you think there's some marginal benefit deriving from the Haig transfer of his support to?
Absolutely, and if Doug's right and Dole wins, I think we'll say Haig made a difference.
If, as you, both of you say, Kemp comes in 4th in New Hampshire, does that mean that we're going to see Kemp out of the race after New Hampshire?
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. He's gone. Who else do you think is going to drop out of the race after
Well,
New
I
Hampshire?
mean, I think that we can say that Mr. DuPont's gone, and now we know Mr. Haig's gone. So
we've got Robertson, we've got Dole, and we've got Bush remaining in the race.
Sir, reminds you of the Democrats in 1984.
Let's talk about
I'm not sure that I agree, by the way, that Kemp is gone. I think he may stay alive for a while, too.
He's broke and he's in debt.
Just to see through Super Tuesday what happens. I don't think he can get very far, but I think he stays.
What was Gephardt's formula of success in Iowa, and why did he get hot so late?
Well, I think Dick Gephardt has thought through the race and better than anybody else. And the reason he did well in Iowa is he came right down to an issue of us versus them. It's a hot issue with the Democrats. It's something that's worked before.
Who's them?
Them is the establishment. Us is the ordinary people playing by the rules. And he's been able to put that together along with the trade issue, which is an important issue and works for him. And that's where he is today.
A representative from Iowa by the name of Dave Nagel is reported to have given the formula to Gephardt. And the formula is appeal to the economic losers, appeal to the farmers, the industrial workers in a deflation-ravaged state. Do you think there's some of that in Gephardt's message?
Sure, and it's very populist, and it was very appealing to a share, a big enough share to win in
Iowa,
but not necessarily an appeal that goes broadly. And frankly, I think that Gephardt, not because of his trade policy, but because of some inconsistencies between his campaign rhetoric and his voting record, has an accounting due him.
But your other point is, and I wonder whether you agree with this, you're a pollster, and you poll the whole country in one form or another, but I want to ask you this. Are the depressed pockets, now, in southeastern Iowa, Gephardt did very well, a depressed area.
Right.
Are there enough depressed areas nationally, and Doug seems to think not, so that appeal, this populist appeal to the depressed people in the country is really going to work nationally for him?
No. I mean, there has to be some component of hope and some component of optimism. His whole message is fighting back. That is a good message. It helped Hubert Humphrey, it helped Harry Truman, it helped Walter Mondale. But it's not necessarily the only message. And I think what Doug's saying is this is a crackerjack election. There's going to be a surprise in every primary package. And don't get ahead of yourself and think that we know what's going to happen, because it's going to change from week to week.
Now, Gephardt is charged with flip-flopping, okay? How serious is that, in your judgment, as a charge, if it can be established that, in fact, he has flip-flopped for apparently opportunistic reasons?
Fact of the matter is, consistency is going to count for a lot. And that's going to be the charge that I think Dick Gephardt's going to have to deal with. He's smart. He'll have to figure out how he's going to deal with it. But that's the one versus being part of the establishment.
Is it enough to crush him?
It could be. You know, the interesting thing is he has to get his head above the pack far enough for the press to focus on him and focus on hard. When they focus on him and focus on hard on the flip-flops, that's a big problem for him.
All right, suppose Gephardt were to surprise everyone and not come in first in New Hampshire, not come in second in New Hampshire, but come in third in New Hampshire. What happens to Gephardt then?
Well, I think what it tells you is something about the Democratic race. At that stage, we've got a 5-candidate race. Jackson, Gore, plus Simon, Gephardt, and Dukakis. Wide open, anything can happen. If Gephardt comes in second, then I think you start to narrow the field, and then it becomes very interesting.
I think the most important thing of Gephardt coming in third is that Simon has come in second, which means that both of them are alive.
As well as Gore.
All right, let's talk about Dukakis. Dukakis is the favorite now in New Hampshire.
Without a doubt.
In all probability, he's going to win by about 10 points against his next nearest contender. That being the possibility, let me ask you this. How much does Dukakis have to win by in New Hampshire to prove that he is a true winner? In other words, so the victory redounds to him and not somebody who might be only 4 points away from him.
Clearly by 10 points is my answer.
And my answer is don't play the expectation game. I mean, if Dukakis wins, we'll know that he looks solid or he doesn't look solid. I think he's been covering his bases. I think he looks solid.
I want to know this. How well did Dukakis do in Iowa? I know what the percentage of the vote that he got. I know, which was what, 19%?
About 21.
20%, and he was behind Simon and he was behind Gephardt. But I want to know whether that's a victory for Dukakis. He comes from the People's Republic of Massachusetts, your state, I believe, a liberal state.
I come from California, John.
You come, I'm sorry, you come from California. You act like, in some respects, ideologically like you come from Massachusetts, but I don't hold that against you.
Oh,
some of my dearest friends are from Massachusetts. But let me ask you this: was it a win for Dukakis when you consider the baggage that he had going into Iowa?
I'll tell you the most important thing. He stayed alive and was strong, and he dominated Boston television on Monday night and Tuesday morning. That's why it was important for him, because that kept him alive and strong and in a commanding position in New Hampshire.
Do you agree that it was a victory for him in Iowa?
He did fine. He stayed alive, and he's in good position as far as New Hampshire. But the race goes on from there.
And the interesting thing is that his money advantage, as translated in organization, will now start to show up in some of the other states like Minnesota, South Dakota, and so forth that happened between New Hampshire and Super Tuesday.
Paul Simon had been falling like a rock until he got the Des Moines Register endorsement. Then his career seemed to stabilize politically in this race, and then he actually surged in Iowa. Do you think that his current attacks, quite telling and close to the bone attacks against Gephardt, particularly on the flip-flop issue, are a sound strategy for him, or do you think they'll backfire?
Well, he needs to finish in second place. He can't afford to accept the status quo. It's the only avenue open to him. I'm not sure there's enough time to inflict the damage. It's a question mark in my book.
Every poll I've seen in New Hampshire shows Simon within margin of error of Gephardt. But he's got to bring Gephardt's numbers down, or he's got to surpass him somewhere. He needs a second in New Hampshire.
If he doesn't have a second in New Hampshire, what happens, Doug?
He will limp along, but I think his financial base just is wiped out, and I just don't see him being very competitive in the South.
Who's going to be out of the Democratic ranks after New Hampshire, Peter?
Don't know. Bruce Babbitt, clearly, but I'm not, and Gary Hart for all intents and purposes. But beyond that, I'm not willing to predict.
Gary Hart's scoring about a 6 in the poll, and he's going steadily down. You think he's going to be as low as he was perhaps in Iowa?
Gary Hart has gotten the message from the voters.
He can't be any lower than he was in Iowa.
On Wednesday morning, who will emerge as the winner of the Democratic winner of the New Hampshire primaries? Peter?
Dukakis.
Dukakis, and one other interesting number is what Al Gore can do in New Hampshire. If he gets any kind of a showing at all that surprises people, that'll be an interesting story and it'll help him a lot.
Who's going to come in second among the Democrats in New Hampshire? Peter?
Tough call. Maybe Gephardt.
Maybe Gephardt?
Yeah.
You mean Simon could eke it out?
I'm not willing to say yet that Simon can't do it.
You're saying it looks like Gephardt, but it's shaky. What do you say?
Too close to call.
Too close to call. So that means it's third is either Gephardt or Simon, and third is either Gephardt or Simon, right?
Right.
Presidential candidate Jesse Jackson in 1984 got 2% in Iowa. This go-around, he got 9%, over a 400% increase. Question, Peter Hart, what's the future hold for Jesse Jackson?
Jesse Jackson's going to be March's candidate. We're going to talk about him more than anybody else in the month of March as a Democratic candidate.
Why?
Why? Because he's going to do well in Super Tuesday. And I tell you, don't dismiss the possibility that Jesse Jackson just might win Illinois. And if he wins a northern industrial state, hold on to your hats.
Do you go along with
The only person that'll get more talk between now and mid-March than Jesse Jackson is Pat Robertson, for many of the same reasons, although he will not win in the North, but he will win a lot.
What kind of numbers are we talking about for Jesse going into the convention with delegates? 600? Many is that?
Oh, more than 600. I would tell you 1,000, and don't remember 4,000 delegates. Or
25% of the delegates going into the convention?
I can see it.
You can? You go along with that?
20 to 25%. No
All
question.
right, quick question. Between New Hampshire, which is next Tuesday, and 3 weeks later, March the 8th, which is Super Tuesday, we have a number of Democratic primaries. We got Minnesota, South Dakota, Maine, Vermont, and Wyoming. I'll repeat, Minnesota, South Dakota, Maine, Vermont, and Wyoming. What's the impact of those primaries over the next 3 weeks before Super Tuesday as far as developing momentum is concerned?
If Gore can dominate because of money and organization in those, he has a big head up going into Super Tuesday. I don't mean Gore. I meant Dukakis. If Dukakis can dominate because money and organization.
Do you think he will?
I think he will, although Gore may pull a surprise in Wyoming.
What about on the other side? We have Minnesota, South Dakota, Maine, Vermont, South Carolina, Wyoming, and Kansas among the Republicans before Super Tuesday. Who's going to dominate those?
The biggest one of those you didn't list, John, that's South Carolina, which Robertson may beat Bush and lead into Super Tuesday 3 days later, which is a very, very big story.
Doug Bailey, you graduated from the Fletcher School of Diplomacy. You know all about this stuff. We got hearings going on now about Noriega being a drug trafficker and a multi-billionaire almost. Question. These hearings have been called by Senator Kerry a proven 98% ADA liberal Democrat. It is possible, some think, that this could develop into a mini Iran-Contra affair, and it's also possible, since it occurred during this administration, it could rub off negatively on George Bush in kind of an oblique and fuzzy way. Do you see anything to that?
Well, I think you've written an interesting scenario, and it's pure speculation, although I suspect that the timing is not totally irrelevant, and how the affair plays out, I don't know. Thus far, I don't think it's hurt Bush at all.
The Iran-Contra thing has not...
No, the Noriega hearing.
You think Iran-Contra has hurt Bush?
Absolutely, because there are remaining questions.
Let me ask you this question in regard to Iran-Contra. Peter, I'll ask you. Do you think that Iran-Contra became reductively a war peace issue in Iowa, and since the Iowans are very concerned about war and peace, I recall, what was it, 1982? They were the first state to get into a nuclear freeze mentality and vote, and that therefore Iran-Contra was particularly telling as a blow to hit Bush with in Iowa?
No, I don't think it had anything to do with war peace. What it had to do is playing by the rules. And the difficulty here is that there was one set of rules set up for one group of people and a different set of rules for everybody else. And for George Bush, he hasn't explained himself. At some stage of the game, he has to come clean. And whether it's this month, next month, or whenever, he's got to be able to explain what his relationship and what he was doing. That's the question, and that's what hurt him.
You deal a lot with the press, don't you?
Yes, sir.
Do you think that the press is responsible for building momentum? Thus, in Iowa, Gephardt won, a significant victory, got very little attention, relatively speaking. Robertson was the darling of the press because it was a better story. Robertson got more momentum because there was more press, so the press builds momentum, so the press anoints and picks our national leaders. What do you think of that?
Well, it's certainly not intentional, but it is absolutely true that one of the big phenomenons of the last week is that the two people who won have gotten less attention than a guy who came in third, and therefore neither one of them get either the benefits or the deficiencies of having won. Dole doesn't get the focus and therefore the hard look by the press at all of his policies, and Gephardt doesn't get the bump in the polls, which he should have gotten by winning the Democratic primary. Instead, it's Robertson.
But Dole did get a slight bump, did he not?
Oh, sure, he got a bump, but he doesn't get the focus. He doesn't get the hard focus of the press, which is what happens when you become the front runner. He's now the front runner for this nomination. He's not getting the hard focus because they're looking at Robertson.
Peter, are you satisfied with the role of the press in this campaign thus far? For example, you have the rather Bush phenomenon, and you have the Jim Gannon treatment of Bush at the convention. Not the convention, but the debate. And does that mean that the Iran-Contra affair was brought back into prominence and it hurt Bush? Or does it mean that since Bush looked good, I think, in both confrontations, that it actually helped Bush? How do you sort it out?
Well, let's sort it out through the voters' eyes. As far back as last September, when we were working with the Chicago Tribune, we asked how the voters felt about the press, and we had half the voters dissatisfied with their coverage of politics, and what they said is it's too personal and too biased. So how's the press doing? Not so well in the eyes of the voters, and that's what really counts.
Getting too close to the bone, is that what they were doing?
Well, the point is, from the voters' point of view, you're not getting close enough to the issues or the agenda. You're not giving us a sense of where things are going.
1 minute, just 1 minute, Doug. Have you not polled in Chicago, too, about George Bush?
I certainly have looked at Mr. Bush.
And what have you discovered about him?
Soft. I mean, one of the things that I can tell you is we ask a question this for the Wall Street Journal. If George Bush were 5th in line at an airline ticket counter and there was only one seat left on the plane, what would he do? Here's the answers from the voters in Iowa. He would either pull rank to go to the front, or he would stand in the line, be a doormat.
What do they say about other candidates?
Oh, to give you an example, Bob Dole, he would negotiate his way onto the plane.
How about
Jack Kemp?
Yeah.
He would charm his way onto the plane. How about Pete DuPont? He'd buy the plane.
How about Haig?
Haig, he'd bull his way to the front of the line. And how about Pat Robertson?
What?
He would say to everybody, let us pray. They'd get down on their knees, and he would walk around to the front of the line.
I've got a quick question for you. The darling of the Democrats in the campaign in Iowa and pre-Iowa was Bruce Babbitt. If it's true that the press is all-powerful, how come Babbitt did so badly? We got about 5 seconds.
I think Babbitt had some advantages from the press, but he attacked his opponents at the end. And
But it also proves that the press is not omnipotent.
Absolutely.
A brokered convention or another candidate in the race who's not in now, i.e. on the Democratic side, Cuomo or Bradley, what has to happen on Tuesday to enhance that possibility?
Very simple. Gephardt loses and finishes 3rd. That leaves 5 candidates going south. And opens up the possibility that nobody's going to have it. If Jesse comes out of the north in Illinois strong, look for somebody else to get in.
What's the probability of that happening on the Democratic side, do you think? That, you know, look at the whole picture of there being some kind of an outside candidate who we don't see now coming in.
4 to 1, 5 to 1 odds.
So those odds have increasingly contracted. Let me ask you, on the Republican side, any possibility of another candidate coming in?
No, not another candidate. But if Bush wins on Tuesday in New Hampshire, I think the odds are about 50-50 for a brokered convention on the Republican side. Brokered not with a new candidate, but with Pat Robertson in there with 500, 600 delegates, and nobody having a majority.
Do you see it that way?
Hey, he's the expert.
I've never heard this before.
No, and it's going to be a shocker.
But it could happen.
Can happen, and can happen on the Democratic side. Don't write it off.
Peter, thanks for being my guest on One-on-One. Likewise, you, Doug Bailey. It's great to see you both.
John McLaughlin's One-on-One.
This program is set in motion by a grant from the MetLife family of companies. Over 43 million people turn to us for their financial security.
And by PepsiCo.
Can I help you? Can I help you? Ah!
The first thing every PepsiCo employee learns is,
Can I help you?
For a transcript, send $4 to Federal News Service, 620 National Press Building, Washington, D.C., 20045. Specify program date. Topics are selected by Mr. McLaughlin, and the opinions expressed are solely those of the participants.
Next, Gordon Peterson hosts a discussion of the major news events of the week. Watch Inside Washington next on KCET.